thought it was going to be a normal road trip. Just another weekend getaway to rekindle our spark. Something my wife, Emily, insisted on. We'd been married for 6 years, and while the honeymoon phase had faded, I still loved her deeply. Sure, things had been tense lately. She'd been distant, quieter than usual, but I chalked it up to work stress. She had a way of bottling things up. The drive started off well enough. The mountains were beautiful that time of year, and we spent the first few hours laughing and reminiscing about the road trips we took back when we were still dating. But that carefree mood didn't last long. It was dusk when it happened. A black van screeched around the corner ahead of us, forcing me to slam on the brakes. Before I could even react, 2 masked men jumped out, guns drawn. I'll never forget the way Emily screamed, raw, terrified. They yanked us out of the car, threw hoods over our heads, and shoved us into their van. The smell of damp cloth and gasoline filled my nose as I sat there, hands tied behind my back, praying this was just a robbery gone wrong. But when we arrived at a remote cabin in the woods, I realized this was something far worse. They weren't after money. This was personal. We were thrown into a small room with 1 cot, a bucket in the corner, and a single, flickering light bulb overhead. That's when he walked in, the leader. Tall, muscular, with a predatory grin that sent chills down my spine. His name was Rick. He didn't bother hiding his face, which told me one thing. He didn't plan on letting us go. "I've got plans for the 2 of you," Rick said, his voice low and menacing. "You're gonna follow my rules if you want to stay alive." Emily clung to me, trembling, but Rick wasn't looking at me. His eyes were locked on her, and the way he looked at her made my stomach churn. It wasn't until later that night, after Rick left us alone, that I realized the full extent of our nightmare. He wasn't just our captor, he was playing a twisted game. And Emily, she wasn't ready for what was coming. The days blurred together in that cabin. Rick kept us on edge with his unpredictable mood swings. Calm one moment, explosive the next. Emily and I were trapped, terrified, and powerless. He made it clear we were at his mercy. At first, Rick mostly ignored me, focusing his attention on Emily. He asked her questions about her life, her dreams, her fears. He gave her things, little comforts like an extra blanket or a warm meal. Meanwhile, I was left with scraps and silence. I told myself it was just a tactic to break us down, to make us resent each other. I didn't want to believe there was anything more to it. But then things started to change. Emily began responding to him in a way that made my heart sink. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things like laughing nervously at his jokes or thanking him with a smile. I convinced myself she was just playing along, trying to keep him calm, but deep down, I felt something shift. The worst moment came one night when Rick decided to taunt me directly. He dragged me out of the room and forced me to sit in a chair facing a small, grimy window that looked into the room Emily was kept in. "You think she's your wife," Rick said, leaning over my shoulder, his breath hot against my ear. "But people change under pressure, don't they? Let's see how much she loves you." Through the window, I saw Rick step into Emily's room, closing the door behind him. I strained against the ropes binding my hands, shouting at him to stay away from her. He didn't even glance back. Instead, he laughed and walked up to Emily, his voice too low for me to hear through the glass. What I saw next shattered me. Emily didn't pull away when he leaned in close. She didn't scream or fight when he brushed her hair behind her ear. She just stood there, stiff and silent. And then, slowly, she let him pull her into an embrace. My blood turned to ice as I watched her melt into his arms, tears streaming down her face. I told myself it was fear. It had to be. She was doing whatever she could to survive. But when Rick turned toward the window and smirked at me, my stomach twisted into knots. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew it was working. The next day, Emily wouldn't meet my eyes. She didn't speak to me, didn't touch me. She stayed close to Rick, her face a mask of forced calm. And the worst part? She started to look comfortable. Rick noticed my torment. He began making comments, cruel digs that tore me apart piece by piece. "She's got fire in her, your wife. I can see why you fell for her." Shame she's wasted on someone like you. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to scream at Emily, beg her to snap out of it. But I knew Rick was waiting for me to break. He wanted me to snap, to give him a reason to hurt me, or worse, hurt her. So I swallowed my pride and stayed silent, even as my world crumbled around me. But it wasn't silence that saved me. It was the realization that Emily wasn't the same person I thought I knew. And as much as I hated Rick, I hated myself more for wondering. Was she falling for him, or was this just survival? I lost track of how long we'd been in that hellhole. Days? Weeks? All I knew was that Rick's hold over Emily tightened with every passing moment. She wasn't just complying with him anymore. She was changing. Her once defiant spirit had been replaced with something else, something unrecognizable. Rick's taunts became bolder, more vicious. He started forcing me to witness moments I could barely stomach. He'd call me into the room and drape his arm around Emily's shoulders, grinning like a predator showing off his prize. "Look at her, Jason," he sneered one evening. "Isn't she beautiful when she's relaxed? Guess I've got the magic touch." Emily sat beside him, her face a mix of shame and something else I didn't want to admit. I wanted to believe she was just surviving, playing along to keep us alive. But the way she looked at him, it wasn't fear. It was something closer to trust. And then came the night that broke me. Rick ordered me into the main room, tying my hands to a chair positioned in the center. He dragged Emily in moments later, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously between us. "What are you doing?" I growled, struggling against the ropes. Rick chuckled, circling me like a predator. "I thought you should see what real loyalty looks like. You know, just so there's no confusion about where her heart really lies." He walked over to Emily and pulled her close. She flinched at first but didn't resist. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. "Emily," I said, my voice breaking, "you don't have to do this. We can fight him together." She didn't look at me. Rick leaned down, whispering something in her ear. Whatever he said made her shudder, but she nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Then, to my utter disbelief, she kissed him. It wasn't forced. It wasn't a quick, reluctant peck. It was real, deliberate. My stomach twisted as I watched her give herself to him in a way she hadn't with me in months. I yelled her name, begged her to stop, but my words fell on deaf ears. Rick turned to me, his smirk more venomous than ever. "You see that? That's not survival, buddy. That's a choice." She made it. Couldn't breathe. The woman I'd loved for years, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, had slipped away from me completely. And Rick, he reveled in my torment. "Here's the thing, Jason," Rick said, crouching down to meet my eyes. "I don't need her loyalty. I've already got it. But you're nothing now. Just dead weight." I wanted to kill him. I wanted to scream at Emily, shake her, make her remember who we were, who I was. But as I sat there, tied up and powerless, I realized something that hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just Rick's doing. Emily had made her choice. She didn't fight for me. She didn't fight for us. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. The days after that night were a blur. Something in me had snapped. The man I used to be, the hopeful, determined husband, was gone. I was hollow, operating on pure survival instinct. Every time I looked at Emily, I felt a mix of rage and despair so intense it made me sick. Rick noticed. He fed off it. "You're awfully quiet these days, Jason," he'd say with a smirk, leaning casually against the wall. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe it's just hard to speak when your wife's too busy whispering sweet nothings in my ear." Emily stayed by his side almost constantly. She rarely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were clipped, empty. I stopped trying to reach her. What was the point? She wasn't mine anymore. Then came the escape, or at least the opportunity. Rick had left one evening to handle business, leaving us under the watch of one of his lackeys, a scrawny, nervous guy named Mike. He was sloppy, inattentive. I knew it was our best chance. "Emily," I whispered as we sat in the dimly lit room, "we can do this. When Mike falls asleep, we make a run for it. Together." She looked at me with those familiar, beautiful eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the woman I married. But then she shook her head. "No, Jason," she said quietly. "It's too risky. We'll never make it. We'll die here if we don't try." I hissed, my frustration boiling over. "What's happened to you, Emily? Where's the woman who used to fight for us?" For me, her expression hardened. "I'm doing what I have to do to survive. You don't understand what it's like." "I don't understand?" I spat. "I've been in the same hellhole as you, watching you change. Watching you choose him." Her face twisted with guilt? Or was it something else? Before she could respond, the door creaked open. Rick was back. He walked in, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "What's this?" he said, his voice low and amused. "A little lover's quarrel?" I glared at him but said nothing. Rick chuckled and crossed the room to Emily, draping an arm around her shoulders. "Don't worry, Jason," he said, grinning. "She's in good hands." That was the last straw. I waited until Rick turned his back, his guard down for the first time since this nightmare began. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. Chaos erupted. Emily screamed. Mike scrambled to pull me off Rick, but I didn't stop. I rained blows on Rick's face, years of pent-up rage fueling every strike. "Jason, stop!" Emily shouted, grabbing at my arms. "You're going to get yourself killed." But I didn't care. I was ready to die if it meant taking him with me. Finally, Mike managed to wrestle me off Rick, pinning me to the ground. Rick staggered to his feet, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. For a moment, I thought he was going to kill me right then and there. But instead, he just laughed. A low, menacing sound that chilled me to the bone. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, wiping the blood from his face. "But guts won't save you, Jason. Not now." He turned to Emily, his expression dark. "Make your choice, sweetheart. Him or me." The room went silent. My heart pounded as Emily looked between us, her face pale and stricken. For a brief moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe she'd finally see reason. Maybe she'd choose me. But then, slowly, she stepped toward Rick. "I'm sorry, Jason," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I have to do what's best for me." The words hit me like a bullet. Rick grinned triumphantly, pulling her close. My world crumbled as I realized the truth. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She had chosen this. She had chosen him. That night, Rick threw me into the back of a van and drove me miles away, dumping me on the side of a desolate road. As the van disappeared into the darkness, I sat there, broken and alone, the weight of Emily's betrayal crushing me. Was it love, survival, or something darker? I may never know. All I know is that the woman I loved died in that cabin, and the person who replaced her was someone I'll never forgive.